everyone tells you, right? Hey, we're in this modern age. You should be on video. You should be out there. It's really important. You see all these great examples, podcasts, Mr. Beast, all of them. And you get to see from there, right? Like the external kind of benefits of this. You get more likes on the social media posts. You get more attention. You're constantly top of mind. Those are all true. Very hard to deny any of that. I think there are many internal benefits or rewards for putting yourself out there that don't necessarily meet the eye. And I'll start with a little anecdote, which is I was speaking to a college student. For some reason, people will tap me and say, hey, can you talk to this college student who's looking for a job? It's a tough job market. And I'm like, sure. Don't know how much I can help. I'm not a college student today that's successfully gotten a job, gotten many jobs. So I guess I can help you there. So what I usually say is, I'll give all the conventional and somewhat unconventional advice, talk to people in your industry, network with 50 people, don't just spray and pray your job applications, could take a targeted, focused approach. But then I will start to go into the wonky things like, hey, you should put yourself out there, post your projects on LinkedIn, go, if you have a GitHub repository, share some of those things you've done on LinkedIn, on YouTube, especially today. It's a very cutthroat market. Now that applies throughout your whole life, I believe. And now I'm starting to think it's a lot more than that. So I'll start with the one anecdote, which is this really clicked for me when I was at this conference, HR Tech for work. And I told myself, I'm going to have this quota of interviewing 10 to 15 people in the industry and learning from them because it's going to be good for me, good for my job. Simple as that. So I use my $25 to $30 equipment set and just rock this quota, speak to 15, 20 people. As that's happening, there are three things that I've noticed that have changed within me and then also in the external environment. One is I am way more confident speaking. Like to this day, it is from last week, from that Tuesday where I was very kind of apprehensive. I'm just feeling like a much better speaker. I'm more confident. And it makes sense, right? I'm being told and continuously reinforcing to myself, I'm enough. There's nothing else I need to know right now that I'm missing in order to conduct this interview with someone else. That's number one. Two is just, the level of comfort. You're just, you're in the zone. You're like having fun. You're in a flow state. And now it's harder for me to doubt that like that flow state can be achieved again once you do it 10 to 15 times. So I feel almost more confident to be able to go on a stage to do a bigger talk now. Cause now I've been in these uncertain environments talking to these people and I feel so much more likely to be okay if I have to go jump on a stage and make a 10-minute presentation about something. And the last part is the storytelling piece. So now that I've heard 10 other people tell their stories, these are imprinted in my brain and I can use them for conversation in the future. And as I was filming all of these stories, I noticed that everyone around me was like, hey, what are they doing? That sounds like a cool idea. They're being interviewed. What are they talking about? Humans are so drawn into stories that they cannot help but join the campfire and circle around. So there's that benefit too, right? If I'm trying to get more interviews, I was just able to get a few by people saying, hey, what are you doing over there? I want to be interviewed too. I want to feel important. So a long monologue, but I am very, very invigorated about this topic now. And it just feels like perfect timing because we have kind of discussed the importance of this ourselves. Of course, that's part of why we're here.
Yeah, I think our goal is to find heuristics, rules of thumb for navigating life, to live a happier life. And I guess in that sense, also be successful if that's part of being happy. And I think being able to tell a story is a tool that is so instrumental and ingrained to being a human being. Because before we had, the newspaper, TikTok, whatever, we told stories around the campfire, like you said. And that's how we shared religion, how we shared mythology, how we shared how to cultivate crops, whatever it may be. We shared it via storytelling. And we would usually use metaphors to convey deeper, more abstract thoughts. And so I think being a master storyteller is important for you to really convey your message, but also to change your internal narrative about yourself, that you are worthy of speaking and conveying information. Like what you have to say does matter. And it's interesting to hear how you spoke to 15 people and you interviewed all these people. And I'm sure at first it was scary or you're a little nervous to do it, but after a while you realize, okay, hearing other people speak and then speaking back to them makes me feel like what I have to say does matter. And by putting yourself out there, you train that muscle of storytelling and putting yourself out there, which both appear as confident, charismatic, which goes back to last week's conversation.
Absolutely. And I was thinking about how I talked about, if you look at it, there's 3 or 4 kind of ways you can interact with content. You can, of course, be a consumer, right? You're looking at eyeballs, your eyeballs are looking at content, you are reading something, you are watching a video, of course, very important. Then I think the next category is actually being a compiler. You take a bunch of information and you turn it into something, a recap, a book, that instead of sharing necessarily original thought, you are taking some of the best thoughts and compiling them. Actually, as a DJ, that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm taking a lot of different records, finding my taste, my favorites, and putting them into a little story for someone to enjoy. The next 2, one is the vessel. So the vessel is kind of what I was doing. I was interviewing lots of people. I have to be good at, to your point, capturing the story and making sure that I can convey it to the world, distribute it to the world. But in that, of course, lies tons of skills of interviewing somebody, lots of practice required. And then the final is like really being a full-on creator where you are the one doing the interview, sharing your thoughts, sharing your perspective. Now, of course, these are very fluid kind of stages or environments. But my immediate thought was like, of course, you mentioned the apprehension and kind of the nervousness of starting this journey. And I think the easiest way to kind of progress through these stages is to see those stages, right? And say, okay, well, I don't have to go from consuming all the way to creating right away. There are these mid stages you can kind of jump into first, at least for me, especially the journey from interviewing to now ready to go on stage makes so much sense because it's like, well, I was a vessel. I just listened and I kind of provoked 20 stories out into the world. Now, when it's time when someone asks me to tell a story, I can chop up these 20 stories that I heard and my brain has already digested those and came up with some sort of original thought. So I wanted to share that because I think like part of this is, to your point of becoming a master storyteller, it can be kind of scary. And if you kind of find these interloping steps in between, you can find an easier path there. At least that's the case for me.
Yeah. What you said about digesting other people's stories to come up with your own original thought reminds me of Richard Feynman's famous quote, which is, you only truly know something when you're able to teach it. And I think when it comes to storytelling, there are 2 avenues that you can pursue. You can either tell a story based on your memory, your past experiences, or you can make something up. That's kind of the people, when people lie to you, they're fibbing, they're creating something out of their imagination. And you can kind of almost tell the difference between someone's lying to me or someone is telling me something that actually happened to them. And regardless of which avenue you go through, you're guiding people through your own mental image. You're creating an image in your mind. You're bringing other people to visualize that same event. And for me, when I tell my stories, which by the way, I don't know if I've mentioned this, but as I traveled the world, 2023 to 2024, I started taking on storytelling. mainly because really crazy things happened to me and I just really wanted to share. I wanted other people to hear what happened to me. And the more I told the stories, the better I got at it. And then I started writing just stories not about my past, but also about my imagination. And when you do that, you start to realize that you're actually conveying feelings. It's an art form. It's not just conveying facts. You're conveying, I felt this way. This is how this makes me feel. When I tell stories about a rabbit that has really long legs, there's somehow feeling attached to that. There's no factual aspect to that. And so guiding people through your imagination is a vital skill because it makes you feel like you are worthy of speaking your own thoughts, your feelings matter. And if you have really complex ideas that you don't know how to share, because feelings are complex, like it can be hard to describe it with very concise and succinct words. Sometimes you need some to guide people towards a feeling. I I really like the idea of musicians and DJs being puppet masters, and they're just pulling the strings to make you feel certain emotions or to make you dance in certain ways. And that's the same feeling I get when I tell my stories. When I tell my stories, I look at the people I'm talking to, like you, for example, and I don't think about them. I'm actually in my story. And as I'm world building, creating little details here and there, I try to make sure that I imagine it and I really see it. And every once in a while, I'll get a question from someone like, "Oh, what were they wearing?" Or "Did they actually do this?" And it would make me realize that, oh, there are details that I'm not conveying. So I'm not guiding people exactly the way I want to. And the more you repeat your story, the more you realize, okay, my path has to be more narrow if I want to convey that exact complex emotion that I really want to.
Yeah. Two thoughts came to mind. I mean, first off, you made the analogy to music. Um, Similarly, right? Like there's this idea of riffing in music. You know, everyone just gets together, someone starts playing the triangle, and all of a sudden there's a beat, and you're off to the races, as you will. Similarly, with storytelling, right? You have this other person who's a captive audience, and they're in some ways co-creating with you, right? They're asking these questions that are important, so that you can continue to build out the story. So I think that's a very powerful piece to this. As you can see, my dog is chewing me alive right now, so I apologize. Uh, he wants to co-create with this as well. It's probably actually Andres because he hears your voice and he knows who you are and he misses you. So you do have to come by soon.
I have to come by. I saw a toy that online that I want to get him. It's a bark box, I think it is.
Yeah,
Read about it where you tear the toy open and there's another toy inside in those.
I need to consult you on his toys because he can be very crazy. As you can see, he bites everything. So there's a very serious level of toughness required for this toy to be with him a day after he's gotten it.
Yeah. Chino. So you were saying about riffing and how that relates to storytelling.
Yeah. So to expand on that, I was thinking about how the listener or the person, yeah, that's receiving the story, it also ends up playing a very active role in it. And we also spoke about the importance of presence before. What I've realized after actually being on the receiving end of some of your more imaginative stories is, yeah, basically feeling entranced and present in the moment. You can't help but, you know, kind of let go of anything else that's happening around you in the environment. And that's why I mean you become an active player. And as we've kind of alluded to, and of course, I personally see the benefits of it. I'm sure you do. Is this act of being present, right? It feels good for yourself. And what better feeling than two people sharing a moment and feeling present together? Because then once again, you're basically co-creating. You're in an environment. It's almost like an invisible shield has been created between whoever the storyteller and the listeners are, and you are all in this imaginative world together to build on it, to grow it, to evoke childlike kind of feelings, right?
Yeah. The whole idea of being in a trance is very real. And for me, there's a couple things I want to talk about, but when I tell stories and I'm in that trance, and I'm hoping to convey that trance to other people as well. And I find that when I tell my stories in person in a group of people, no matter how big the group is, I'm able to get in that trance. And if there's a distraction, I can lower the trance and bring it back, whatever. I'm really able to do this. And I'm saying this not because out of ego, but people have told me I'm good at telling stories and it's something I've worked towards. But whenever I turn on a camera and I try to tell a story on the camera, for some reason, I sound like a robot. The trance is gone. And that's why we're talking about putting yourself out there, because you have to find your voice. You have to find what works, what doesn't. How do I sound like? What is my internal narrative that I tell myself, oh yeah, I'm a great storyteller, maybe in person, maybe when I am able to capture people's attention. But when it's exposed to the world of attention deficit, it's a different game. You have to use more visual cues. Your sound has to be more captivating. So putting yourself out there helps you iterate on your creative endeavors and trying to see how you work. I also want to make sure I touch on, continue touching on music, because this is something I think we're both interested in. And I find jazz, like really modern jazz, to be weird. That's just my perception. It's weird because you're hearing a pattern and you're hearing this, like, what you think it's going to sound like, and then the jazz solo might start and it'll start guiding you towards notes that you never even, and just weird feelings. And this weird feeling you get when you hear jazz is someone guiding you towards a certain emotional state. And it's what the person is feeling and is guiding you towards. It's the same feeling I get when I listen to new music overall. Like, for example, I like Rez. And Rez, every time I listen to Rez, I get that, like, ooh, dark, evil feeling when I listen to her. Or when I listen to the Succession theme song, I get like, oh, royalty. Like, oh, I feel like I'm someone of importance. Or if I listen to something comical, it'll guide me towards something like whimsical and comical. So music is another form of storytelling. When we create, we are guiding people towards certain emotional states.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Stories definitely are not just in the conventional sense, right? Art, I would say art is a great one too. Immediately I thought of Banksy, who kind of captures the story of the moment of the culture. And even with music, it is kind of wild now that you say it, right? Anything, even today, when you look at most videos, TikToks or otherwise, you're told to add a musical element. Why? So that people can follow along and immediately their attention is captured. And to your point, you can also use it to set the tone. Um, with modern jazz, I immediately thought of the blues because I had just gone to Nashville and there was just this blues bar that like blew my mind. Like some of the best, kind of local musicians, and they just kept riffing, and it was very yeah, it was kind of like you kind of evoke your feelings however you want, right? Because unlike electronic music or others, there's not often a set list. These musicians just know the songs. They can pull it up and learn it in the minute. And, the singer starts because they often lead the group, but then the whole group is collectively creating those emotions, right? Because they're all kind of in it somehow. And to me, that is just like true like magic, because how are these four different individuals who are dealing with four different, completely different human situations able to kind of join together to evoke a feeling that now the entire audience can kind of take and, of course, internalize, right? It's not like if I play a certain riff on the guitar because I'm feeling sad because of what happened today, it doesn't mean that you can't listen to it and be in awe or in wonder or in glee. Um, but often I do think you are kind of helping someone else see your perspective. So that to me is very fascinating.
You know, The way you were describing this, it reminded me of another quote. I'm a quote guy. I can't help it.
Yeah.
Mikhail Tal was a, chess grandmaster, I think in the 60s or 50s. Just like known to be like a really bizarre thinker. And he's quoted for saying, I'm going to read it exactly. He said, "You must take your opponent into a dark, deep, I'm going to say it again. You must take your opponent into a deep, dark forest where 2 + 2 is equal to 5, and the path leading out is only wide enough for one." And when you talk about these blues musicians being together in a group and somehow converging, coalescing into one emotional state, it reminds me of that. There's a forest of possibilities, and together they guide each other into a path towards something that really guides everyone through this dark forest of possibilities.
Yeah. And honestly, when you say that, for some reason my brain went to Beyonce. And just sometimes it feels like by the end of the story, the song, you are actually all meant to kind of arrive at her conclusion of the song, whether that is Jolene in her last country album. Basically, I think like no matter where you start, maybe we all have different feelings, emotions, whatever. By the end of that song, we've all achieved a common understanding. I think often that's what stories leave us with, a common understanding. Even with some of yours, Andres, like at the end of it, we all are, of course, as the reader, you have full, kind of liberty to take what you want, but you achieve a common understanding. So there is kind of like what you're saying, you end in like some level of unity. Then the interpretation is still yours to take, but there is a sense of like something was transmuted, something was transferred from your brain as a storyteller to the reader. And then yes, like there's of course room for subjectivity and gray area, but something was transmuted. Your feeling was kind of impressed, or there was something that happened, like an information exchange that's connected. I guess there's like a technological piece to this we can totally draw an analogy to, whether that's like an open API or something like that.
It's funny you talk about this because this is, in my opinion, and in a lot of other people's opinion, what mathematics is. You are finding a way to communicate your imagination concisely and precisely every single time. Like if I say a circle, I can give you a formula, you can always replicate that circle. But when it comes to the real world and feeling, it's not as clear cut as a circle. It's fuzzy. There's subjectivity behind it. There's randomness. So we use words which carry a lot more information than just like X, for example, or some variable. You can carry more information because there's that fuzziness, there's that randomness, there's that subjectivity, your environment that made you develop that sense of, the word conspicuous. So like maybe to you that, or the word forest, for you, a forest might be pine trees. For me, growing up in South America, it might be more jungle like. So a forest, even the words have a subjective meaning behind them. But when we guide people through their own subjective personal forest, we can hopefully go together towards an idea, a shared common feeling. And maybe that's why these musicians like Beyonce, Taylor Swift, etc., are so popular and so famous because they're able to guide people through the forest towards their own ideas.
I like that. That's really strong. And honestly, that applies to all contexts, even, not to go too deep on it, but even politics, right? You are at the end of the day telling a story and guiding people to your way of thinking. So it's a very important skill. Um, I want to make sure, I think we sprinkled in some very actionable pieces about storytelling and kind of what people can do. So I want to, the question in my mind, and we can always kind of rehash this, is are you telling enough stories? Are you practicing storytelling enough? Now that one is a little personally motivated because I feel like the lulls in my life when I look back and reflect a little are actually periods where I wasn't doing enough storytelling. Your voice feels like it's silenced. You are feeling a little more stagnant. But when I'm able to kind of, whether it's forced like this last weekend or like just intentional about, hey, I need to go about, tell more stories, practice my imagination, do whatever it is to like continue to stay in that flow, I'm able to yeah, just progress very fast. You know, like I feel at least after this last week of just interviewing all these people, I feel very energized and very like in the flow, in the zone. So I think we should all ask ourselves, hey, am I doing this enough? Especially as we're more isolated and all of that. Like, am I telling enough stories? Am I getting them to people so that you can get a reaction and continue to improve it? That's my question, but it is a tricky one. So Andres, feel free to challenge me on it.
Uh, I think it's a very personal question to ask, and it's good to reflect. I think the question can be reframed slightly differently. You can say, am I consuming more than I create? And I want to talk about this idea of creating. Obviously, we all consume a lot, probably more than anyone did in all of history, because we just have this constant stream of information. I don't have to explain it. We all do it. And creating is such a different, it's the opposite of consuming. You're pushing yourself out there. And when it comes to creating, it's really tempting, at least for me, to begin to create a bunch of different things, right? I'll enter the forest of possibilities and start going down a certain path and then just stop. Go back towards the consumption. And one of my earlier on when I started telling stories, probably the most frequent feedback I got, or kind of people were always annoyed when I did this, but not in a bad way. I would tell a story and everyone's captivated and they love it. And I would say, well, that's as far as I got. They're like, you're kidding me. What do you mean? What happens to the rabbit? Like, what happens to Miguel when he sees the bees? He starts listening, hearing them. People would always complain about that. Where are the endings? So you have to learn to exit the forest. You have to learn to practice your endings. And you only do that by deliberately practicing the ending, coming towards a conclusive thought. Like, what was the whole story about? Where did you take me? You can't just enter the forest and go back out, just follow the trail back towards where you were. You have to practice your endings. So what would you say, based on what we've discussed, are some good takeaways, some practical takeaways, and maybe a question to lead our listeners to?
Sure. So I'll start by where you took us, which is yeah, you have to finish the stories. And I think in order to do that, we should feel ready to comfortable just continuously kind of sharing whatever we do have. I don't think we need to like be like, yeah, I have this fully baked story ready to go. We need to share them with our friends, with other people, and start to get some of that feedback earlier so we feel confident that, you know, we can arrive at an ending. Also, I think it's kind of like, you know, a minimum viable product. You should always just like try to zip to the end sometimes. And I think, at least for me, that is helpful. So once again, either you as a writer, as a creator, have an ending in mind, or you're able to kind of generate that from your audience. The other one we talked about, which I think is powerful, is this 4 stages, 4 types of storytelling, or kind of the evolution, which is you start as a consumer, but then the 2 stages in between becoming, you know, whatever you want to call it, a full-blown creator, is you can become a compiler or a vessel. So a compiler is someone who gathers all these things you've consumed, turns it into something that's useful for an audience. The vessel, the communicator, if you want to stick to the 4 Cs, is someone who is able to find these creators and tell their story, right? And then finally is being a creator, which to me is, you know, really trying to share original thought whenever possible. So if you follow that kind of evolution, you don't have to go from consumer to like, full blown YouTube creator star. You can have these kind of stages on the way.